I'm going to speak very briefly about Japan and China. I was, as Francis said, the British ambassador to Japan from 2008 to the end of 2012. And my remarks will be couched in the form of both, firstly, an invitation, and secondly, a proposition. The invitation is to look at the situation which Vikram described in his overview from a Japanese angle. Vikram described the growth of Chinese military power in terms of challenging US hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region beyond the first island chain up to the second island chain. And that's a very accurate description of the possible development of Chinese power. Look at that from the perspective of Japan, which lies squarely in the first island chain. I was struck as ambassador at how broad and across the spectrum there was a fear of China's medium to long-term ambitions in this area. However unrealistic this seems to us, analysing the situation from a Western perspective and seeing all the arguments against Chinese aggression, nonetheless, there is a perception in Japan which is linked to, but not exclusively linked to, its own declining economic power vis-à-vis China, that whereas we in the West see China as a status quo power, in East Asia, China is not seen as a status quo power. And one of the interesting themes which is emerging from this seminar is that although there is a powerful reason which Hamish outlined in his introduction for us to acknowledge and welcome the challenge to the economic status quo, which has ruled for the last 200 years, looking at this from the perspective of an East Asian country, Japan, a liberal democracy, this challenge to the status quo becomes much more problematical. We're focusing at the moment on the radical deterioration of China-Japan relations over the past 18 months or so. It's important to remember, when I arrived in Tokyo in the middle of 2008 as ambassador, the relations between China and Japan were quite positive. We had just had the visit of not only Hu Jintao, but Wen Jiabao to Japan. We'd had good, indeed cordial government-to-government links and discussions. No agreement on joint resource development in the East China Sea, but nonetheless agreement that the relationship between Japan and China was strategically beneficial in the terms of the classical formula. That isn't, of course, underpinned by very much confidence among ordinary Chinese or ordinary Japanese in the bona fides of the other country, because there is a massive history that lies between China and Japan. But I emphasize the point that it is feasible, indeed possible, for China and Japan to craft a constructive relationship of engagement. And I was struck in my first 18 months as ambassador at how people were not only speculating on the decline of the G8 and the rise of the G20, but that both of the groupings would be eventually swept aside by a G2, US and China, which would effectively form world governance. That aspiration died, and I think it died most dramatically at Copenhagen at the end of 2009 with the failure of the climate change negotiations. And the perception that China was not only prepared to cock a snook at the United States president, but also, in the views of some of those taking part in the negotiations, not to acknowledge its responsibilities as an international stakeholder in this important area of global governance, but retreat into a very, very protectionist position. And then, in a sequence of incidents, and I agree with Kai that not all of these necessarily reflect a massive upsurge in Chinese aggression. It's the mixture as before, business as usual, rather than a sudden upsurge of assertiveness. The relationship between Japan and China deteriorated, and the status quo, which had been agreed when the relations between the two countries were normalized in the 1970s, and particularly this very arcane territorial dispute over these islands in the East China Sea, suddenly was allowed to become inflamed into a radical deterioration of the bilateral relationship to a degree that we have not seen effectively for 40 years. Much to the discomfort and disapproval of the Japanese business community, who were horrified that extreme nationalist Japanese politicians were allowed to make the running on these islands and precipitate this deterioration in the bilateral relationship. So there is a perception in Japan that China, that the rise of China not just represents an economic threat, but represents a political threat to Japan. Of course, Japan is conflicted on this. China is by a long way now its major economic and business partner. Therefore, the deterioration of the relationship has a direct negative impact on Japan's economy, which has been struggling out of recession, or at least insipid growth, over the past 20 years. That's why the business community is so hostile to displays of extreme nationalism. Nonetheless, we have seen that deterioration, and although there are, I think, contacts being carried forward on the Japanese and Chinese side at working level to try and find a way through this deterioration, there hasn't to date been very much to show for those efforts. And although the rhetoric is not quite as extreme and inflamed as it was at the end of 2012 with riots in China against Japanese commercial and other interests, the rhetoric is still pretty poisonous. Does this matter to us? I don't want to get parochial here because this is an international seminar and I'm not looking at it from the narrow parochial perspective of the UK. And yet, I just want to remind British participants in this seminar how important a partner Japan is for the United Kingdom. Not just as a political partner, but as a provider of industrial investment into the United Kingdom. 1,400 companies from Japan employing over 140,000 people directly in the United Kingdom, and hundreds of thousands more in the supply chain, in every sector of the economy, from manufacturing through to services. Over half the cars built in Britain, and we now in Britain build nearly as many cars as they do in France, are built by Japanese companies. Japan is a country that in many respects is difficult to position in the world as the economic bubble has receded, but it is still a country which provides over 20% of the world's research and development, 13% of the FTSE, of the Fortune 500, top 500 companies come from Japan. This is an economy which is still the second largest developed economy in the world, with, in proportionate terms, a minute population. So the political, economic, business, scientific, innovatory significance of Japan is very important. And even if there were no other reasons why we should fear the eruption of conflict between China and Japan over these islands, whose ownership is disputed, we would have a direct interest in ensuring that that does not take place. I find it very frustrating as a former British diplomat and in broad terms a friend of Japan that it seems to be so difficult for Japan to get onto the front foot in this political debate. Kai put up a very powerful last slide showing Willy Brandt at the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I agree with him that it is frustrating that it is not possible to envisage a Japanese equivalent to that. But it is important to remember that Japan has apologised, indeed made atonement for its atrocities during the war, and that apology, which was made over many years but formally enshrined in the 1995 statement by the then Japanese Prime Minister Moriyama, not only atones for Japan's conduct, but says three very important things which had never been said before. Firstly, that Japan's foreign policy during the period in question was wrong. Secondly, that its rule in East Asia was colonialist. And thirdly, that its military had been aggressors. Those three statements by the Japanese government were powerful statements of recognition of history and have been endorsed by every Japanese government, every cabinet, since 1995, including the present one, under Shinzo Abe, who is, by some way, the most nationalistic post-war Japanese leader, since his grandfather, Kishi. So I make that point, not in any sense to justify the flat-footed way in which Japanese politicians present themselves on historical issues, which is deeply deeply deplorable and frustrating, but to make the point that it ought not to be impossible for Japan to take the initiative here in order to produce a relationship with China that is more evenly balanced. But my proposition is that given the state of the relationship between the two countries and the absence of any multilateral framework in East Asia, unlike in Europe, through which these issues can be discussed, there is no alternative but to expect the United States to play the role which Kai outlined, the Eikenberry role of the liberal Leviathan. The US is a treaty partner, an alliance partner of Japan. It is the country whose nuclear umbrella protects Japan, and President Obama made explicitly clear in his visit to Japan 3 weeks ago that the disputed islands are covered by that security alliance. This absolves the Japanese from the need to interpret their position of proactive pacifism in a way that is going to destabilize the region by disturbing their neighbors, although I think we should still welcome the way in which the Japanese Prime Minister proposes that Japan should play a more active role in the collective self-defense in the region. And it means that the United States, I'm afraid, for better or worse, for the foreseeable future, will be the power that has to hold the ring in this part of the world. I'm not going to talk at any greater length on this issue, Francis, other than just to emphasize that last point. We've had some fantastic presentations and discussions today which energize us, or should energize us, on the extraordinary power shift that is taking place in the world, which we have to welcome in terms of its contribution to the world's prosperity. But we do have to recognize that there are parts of the world, and East Asia is one, where these shifts of power are perceived to carry not just economic advantage, but also political and security threat. We do not have anything like the mechanisms we need to manage those threats, and that imposes a formidable responsibility on the United States to continue to do so.